Hello, good morning, and welcome back. We have another fantastic day of conference here, so I hope you've all had a great day yesterday and a good evening, relaxing, especially those who sort of joined us for dinner last night. One thing actually, when I started yesterday morning, I realised I completely forgot to introduce myself. So if anybody doesn't know me, I'm Adrian Martin, and I'm the reason I'm standing here is because I've been convening the research group here, the Global Environmental Justice Research Group, who collectively have organised this event. Is that? Yeah, okay. I was warned that I had to be really close to this one, actually. But okay, so for those who didn't hear that, I forgot to introduce myself yesterday, or I forgot to speak into the microphone, one of the two. My name is Adrian Martin. I'm convening the Global Environmental Justice Research Group here, and we're the ones who've organised this event collectively. Anyway, a few announcements, so I'll try not to dig too much into the time we've allotted for our keynotes, because we've got some fantastic presentations again this morning, but a few quick things. Firstly, afternoon break this afternoon, there's some presentations on books that I can't see where Brendan Coulset over there will be organising. Is that enough said on that, or great? A second thing, to reminder about the learning wall that our artist Debbie is doing such an amazing job with, and an encouragement that you had in your packs, these cards where you can just write a few words or even draw something yourself, but something reflecting some ideas you have related to the conference themes or something else. Put it on there, and it's your opportunity to appear on the learning board. So you're strongly encouraged to do that, just to capture a few more of things going on in our brains. Lunchtime, talking about the learning board, there's one out there which was done by Debbie with a local school, and it's on display now in that sort of foyer area. And at lunchtime, I think a few of the school children who are involved in making that will be there, stood next to it. So it'd be nice if a few of you go and have a chat with them. Lost property. We have display exhibit number 1. A nice blue jersey was left. If anybody else has lost anything, we apparently have a lost property room, 1.06. Currently.
This was where the jumper was left.
Oh, okay. No.
So just come and see someone in a
Yeah. A misinterpretation of my notes, but there we go. I guess we don't need a room with only one item. And Slido, we didn't have massive use of Slido yesterday. Perhaps we didn't push it enough, but we do have this sort of accompanying website for posting up comments and questions. All you have to do is use your phone and go to slido.com and put in the code EJ 2019. So if you'd like to do that, it means that also sort of people from outside of this room can see what questions you're putting up, and they can contribute as well. Okay, and then now just as we're not having a plenary tomorrow, so I do also need to, it seems a bit odd to be doing it a third of the way through, but do a bit of a sort of closing stuff in a way, but at least as far as to say a few thank yous. And first off, just to say thank you, there's a sort of a small army of purple t-shirted wonderful students of ours who've been supporting this event. I'm going to have to check my notes for the names, but Corey, Craig, Eva, Tina, Alex, Debbie, and Elise. So a huge thanks to making everything run so smoothly. Secondly, to Jana. Is Jana here? Jana, would you like to come forward? Because we do actually have some. Jana has done a huge job behind the scenes. I'm sure some of you have been in contact and had some discussion, but we have a small gift to thank Jana for all of her work for us. And last but not least, of course, Hannah Gray. Hannah, it hardly needs saying, but has done an absolutely amazing job of organising such a great venue, food, making sure everybody gets here, and everything you can think of. So a massive thank you. So now all I need to do is hand over to Gareth, who's going to chair this morning's plenary session.
Good morning, welcome back. Hopefully you're all feeling refreshed. So this morning's plenary, we've got another two great speakers. So we'll start off with Leah Temper and then Asad Rehman. Same format as yesterday morning. Am I talking into this close enough, or do I need to put it closer to my mouth? You can hear at the back? Good. I have a few questions to help you get to know them a bit better, other than just being a face at the front. Leah hasn't yet told me her answers. Asad actually provided them in advance, and now he's probably forgotten. Well, I can help you with the answers. So same format. They'll each speak for about 25 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion, critiques, comments, and questions. So I'll just introduce Leah first. Leah is an ecological economist. She's a scholar activist and a filmmaker based at McGill University in Canada, formerly associated with the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And she's the founder and co-director of the Environmental Justice Atlas, which a number of you would have been to the session yesterday morning, which was about that. Which maps ecological conflicts and spaces of resistance around the world. And she's a research associate for the Ecozoic program. She's also currently the PI of the activist academic co-production of knowledge for environmental justice, or Acknowledge project, which some of our group members here are also involved in. Published a bunch of journal articles and a book. Welcome, Leah. And Leah's going to be speaking this morning about how environmental justice movement is transforming the world. So over to you. Do you want to radio?
Oh, good day. Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be speaking to you today. So my talk today was how environmental justice movements are transforming the world. And I've adapted it a little bit. Our only hope, how rebel environmental justice movements are transforming the world. And you can see this image of Princess Leia kind of reaching out to the rebels, saying, you know, you are our only hope for defeating the empire. Always nice little Star Wars references to get us started. So a lot of this talk, I had the title before, but a lot of it has been inspired by the fact that last week I was at a conference of the International Society on Transitions. And this conference here, we're really looking at some of these connections between the transformations communities, the transitions communities, and the environmental justice communities. And some of you might be familiar with this framework. It's called the multi-level perspective. So it's a way of understanding how socio-technical systems are transformed through a sort of multi-scale understanding. And the idea is essentially that you have regimes which sort of resist change. You can have like the energy regime, the coal regime, the different types of agro regimes. And these are transformed through sort of niches, like radical innovation happens at the niche level. And so that's the micro level. And then there's different pressures that come from the landscape level. For example, yesterday we were talking Schlossberg, David was talking about these examples of these everyday materialisms. So we could imagine these examples as these little niche innovations that are, scaling up or scaling out in this idea of, transforming the regimes of our society. And then at the macro level, we have kind of big changes. One example to help you conceptualize it could be, a disaster like the Fukushima disaster. So you have this kind of large-scale interruption, and then energy systems are transformed, and different niche innovations that could be, forms of renewable energy are then taken up, and the regimes are transformed. So there's been quite a lot of critiques of this literature on socio-technical innovations, and some of them have, are fairly widespread. There's a lot of technological optimism. There's a lot of focus on, how technology is going to save us. You see here the windmills, electric vehicles. There's really a large focus on kind of low carbon futures at the expense of other sort of environmental concerns. There's, has been some focus on power, but very little attention paid to activism and bottom-up movements within that literature. But what they're but I think there's also, so there's parts of the story that they're missing, I would say. And just as an example, at the conference last week, there was a discussion from the father of the multi-level perspective. His name is Frank Gills, and he gave a sort of pessimistic talk saying, well, there's no sources of countervailing power that are threatening the regimes. And the examples he used was this chart here. I don't know if you can see it very well, but he's saying there's decreasing countervailing power from labor unions. So who are the transformative agents that are going to lead us into this next transformation? I think at that conference, perhaps we were the only people that were bringing forward perspectives from environmental justice movements, indigenous activists, land defenders, and what I will argue in this talk is that these on-the-ground movements have considerable power to prompt these major transformations that transitions and transformation scholars are talking about, and there's not really due attention be given to these movements. So I have been tracking these movements over the past 10 years or so. This is a project I coordinate, co-direct, called the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. And in a sense, this work can be considered sort of like being a socialist historian of these on-the-ground movements. So the aim, a socialist historian, in the words of Vijay Prashad, is to document these stories to help contribute to creating a confident community of struggles. And we are currently within the Acknowledge project doing an analysis of different cases across the Atlas to understand what are the conditions under which these communities kind of lead to transformative changes. So here you can see the Acknowledge project. We also look at different case studies, case studies of resistances and also alternatives emerging, and look at the interactions between resistance movements and the alternatives that emerge from these resistance movements. So what I'm going to present today, I'm going to use sort of 3 stories to illustrate some of the insights about how EJ movements are transforming the world that are emerging from these 2 projects. And just to say that some scientists are have actually some physical scientists have actually come to the conclusion that resistance movements are an important actor. This is from 2012 at the American Geophysical, the Union of American Geophysicists meeting. And this scientist called Brad Werner gave a presentation called "Is the Earth Fucked?" It had quite a big audience, and he actually used different types of modeling, and he came to the conclusion that environmental resistance movements are actually the only hope for, a situation where the Earth is not fucked. And his conclusion was that every other element that he'd put into his model, different forms of regulation and science, was just too embedded in the current economic model. So this is a great model. What I hope to share with you today is a few stories and examples to illustrate how these dynamics are happening today, to show how EJ movements are transforming the world, look at what some of the transformative strategies that they're using, what's working, what lessons can we take away, and what are some of the, if I have time, what are some of the kind of intersections or learnings we can have between EJ studies and transitions and transformations research. And a lot of the focus is on really understanding how different ecological conflicts give birth to movements for environmental justice, how these movements kind of push forward different sustainability transition pathways, and how these transform our social metabolism of our society. And once the social metabolism is transformed, we kind of start the cycle again, because if we're moving to renewable energy, this can give birth to conflicts over windmills, or to mining for lithium and other non-renewable materials. So this is sort of how we analyze the link between environmental justice movements and changes in the social metabolism. And I would also like to make a distinction here between this question of what is transformation. So I think we are all familiar with Nancy Fraser's tripartite understanding or framework of environmental justice that looks at distribution, participation, and recognition. Participation or representation and recognition. What has been extremely useful for me is in the same paper, she actually makes a further distinction, which is what is the difference when we're looking at remedies for environmental justice between affirmative remedies, affirmative or reformist remedies, and transformative remedies. This is something I've developed further in this paper, Blocking Pipelines. So I'll just take you through it quickly. Affirmative remedies are those that aim to reduce the inequalities, but they don't change the underlying system. And transformative remedies are really those that transform the underlying generative framework of society. And if we're talking about distribution, so an affirmative remedy is the social welfare system. Let's transfer resources from one group to the other. The transformative remedy is to abolish capitalism. In terms of recognition, the affirmative remedy is multiculturalism, affirmative action. The transformative remedy is really transforming everybody's sense of who they are. And the example she uses here is the idea of queering. So instead of just saying we're going to privilege these discriminated groups, we break down the concept of gender itself as we understand it and transform everybody's sense of self. And then in terms of participation or representation, the affirmative response is participatory parity. everybody gets to participate in the current system on equal terms. The transformative response is really a deeper questioning of what are the systems and the terms of participation themselves. And here you can see, I put in red some examples that I drew out in the paper, also of what this might look like specifically for environmental justice. So in terms of distribution, the EPA, kind of everybody needs to be equally exposed to toxics. We all need to get the same dose, is sort of the regular affirmative response. And then the idea, no, we need to stop the production of all toxics, would be more of a transformative response. In terms of recognition, we have indigenous rights, animal rights, and the transformative ones is, rights of nature, and say, how do we grant nature subjectivity? In terms of participation, the affirmative response is free, prior, and informed consent, and the transformative responses would be decolonization and moving beyond the state framework, as some examples. So, how do we transform distribution? So here's one case study of the Netherlands. And the Netherlands has been, since 1959, perhaps you've heard of the term Dutch disease. A huge gas field was discovered in Groningen. So it's a country that's been heavily dependent on gas. And in the last year, you can see, here's 2017 compared to 2016, gas production in the Netherlands has completely collapsed. So it's moved from about 45 million cubic meters to something like 12 cubic meters of gas production per year. And the plan is now to completely phase out gas production in the Netherlands. This is the biggest gas field in Europe by 2030. So how did this come about? What was this change due to? So this has actually emerged. There's been a series of earthquakes in the Groningen region as a result of the gas production. And the biggest earthquake in 2012, there was a 3.6 Richter earthquake that was led to several thousands of homes being damaged. Some community members needed to leave their homes, and this kicked off a huge mobilization by all the communities in Groningen asking for a cessation of all gas exploitation from this region. And they were later joined by climate and environmental justice activists from around the country. There was some mass civil disobedience actions that took place. And last year, the Dutch government has said, we can exploit the gas. Technically, the gas is exploitable, but it's not socially acceptable to exploit the gas anymore. Okay, thank you. So this has potentially quite transformative implications for the energy system in the Netherlands. This is a country where about 90% of the homes are connected to the gas grid and use gas for heating. And it's also a major gas resource for Europe. So how can we see this sort of as a transformative struggle for distribution? I think one point is that the members, the Groningers were always saying, we are asking for a complete halt to gas production. The discourse was not reduced to simply issues of compensation and for redistribution of the benefits, and there was huge maldistributions. For example, of the revenues from gas, about only 1% was said to return to the region where the gas was extracted from, with the vast majority going to this central area of the country. There wasn't any reliance on this type of cost-benefit analysis and technical discussions. And actually, from the analysis of the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice, engaging in economic valuation and cost-benefit analysis was the only EJ strategy that was actually counterproductive when it came to stopping extractive and damaging projects. So not to engage in this technical discussions, to use direct action. So how do we actually, get in front and disrupt the flows of capitalism as a means of transformative action? We're also seeing that from the Atlas. And the final one is, of course, to use tactical diversity. So they use forms of direct action. They also use court cases and other lobbying within national government and different forms of cultural messaging. And here's just some statistical results from the Atlas looking at diversity of mobilization forms. And you can see that when there's less than 5 different types of forms of mobilization used, you have about a 7% chance of stopping a project, an unwanted project. If there's more than 10 different forms of action used, that goes up to 17%. The second story I'd like to share with you, I'm going to focus on this idea of transforming participation. What does transformative participation look like? And this is a story about the first blanket ban on metals mining in the world that took place in El Salvador, also in 2017, I believe. So El Salvador is one of the poorest countries. About 1/3 of the community lives under the poverty line. And as a Canadian, I have to say that I think Canada can take a lot of credit for this ban on this mining ban, because it was a Canadian company, the abuses of a Canadian company that really galvanized the entire population to the level of injustice to put in place the mining ban. So what happened was that a Canadian company was trying to mine in a region called Cabañas, and after they were refused their environmental clearance permit, they decided to take the case to the World Bank Tribunal Investor Settlement Dispute, which is a closed door court where corporations can sue governments for damages, for lost profits that are put into place due to environmental protections. And the company decided to sue El Salvador for $300 million of their potential lost profits that they would have gotten. This court case went on for 7 years. And during this whole time, there was a huge campaign in the country pushing a national coalition called the MESA, the National Table Against Mining, including different actors such as the church. Local referenda were held. And the slogan that they used was, water is worth more than gold. El Salvador is an extremely water-scarce country. So in the end, actually the tribunal, I think very much due to pressure from activists, dismissed the tribunal. We can't say that El Salvador won. They didn't really win anything, but they didn't lose. They didn't lose the case. And once this case was dismissed, they proceeded with the ban against metals mining. So what do we learn from this case? Firstly, if you're going to participate, start early. The earlier the mobilization begins, the more likely it is to be successful. So if the mobilization is preventative, there's a 17% chance of stopping the project, compared to less than a 7% if it's after the fact. You have to think within, above, and beyond the state. So what they did in this case is at the local level, they experimented in local forms of democracy. For example, this local referenda where they were voting against mining, community-based consultations. At the same time, at the international level, they were contesting the terms by which their country was participating in the global economy. And this sort of non-democratic fora, such as the World Bank's Investor Settlement Dispute Framework. So while they're doing this, they're continually aiming to redraw the different fora and the scales for justice. And in this case, there was really important links between local and international actors. But just to say that the evidence from the Atlas shows that actually in most cases, the support of international NGOs does not lead to projects being successfully stopped, contrary to what you might think from different theories, such as the boomerang theory. So I think the takeaway message, we do see that the most important actors are local grassroots organizations. And I think the takeaway from here is that you need to have the local actors as leading and the international allies as supporting the movements. The third case is about the world's recycling system. As some of you might have noticed, it stopped working. And this is because in 2017, China said it's not going to accept 24 different types of waste that it had accepted previously. So why did this happen? I began to look into this. I was quite curious. And there is in China, we may not be aware of it, but actually they're saying that pollution is one. What's that noise? Okay. Pollution is one of the main causes of social unrest in the country. But actually, from some insiders, they've actually traced back this transformation to the work of one environmental justice activist and filmmaker who has been making different films about the waste issue in China. He's made one. The first film was called Beijing, Besieged by Waste, and it was seen by members of, by the premier at the time, and he actually used it to close down the different waste dumps that were around Beijing. The second film he made, Plastic China, is about the waste trade from the United States. And insiders say that this film had a huge role in influencing the government to put in place this policy. And this film is really a very personal story about two families. One who owns a waste recycling plant and a family who works there, featuring an 8-year-old girl. So we can see this is just showing you sort of the transformation, the changes before and after. And the entire world's recycling system has been shaken up as a result of this. Canada's had their waste sent back from the Philippines recently. And as a result of this, countries are beginning to put in place bans on single-use plastics. So this story tells us about, what is the role of storytelling in transforming our understanding of who we are. I think part of why this story was so compelling was that it really showed a new face of the identity of how China saw its own identity. And when you see the film, you sort of see also this reflection of ourselves and the waste we produce as this little 8-year-old girl is playing in our waste as well. It's kind of this changing of our own identities, and also this rethinking of categories such as what is waste, what is nature. So this is this process of queering that's taking place. I won't have time. I do have some counter stories here. So what are the cases when transformation does not happen? You know, as you can see, none of these cases do involve racialized or indigenous communities. And actually, we see that those are actually the cases that are really the hardest to stop, and those where communities are most exposed to different forms of repression. So I think I won't have time to talk about this, but there's some interesting links between environmental justice studies and transformation studies. I think the two fields have a lot to feed into one another. And what I would like to put forward is more emphasis on resistance, the role of resistance in transformations, kind of highlighting environmental justice as the place where these intersectional movements against racism, capitalism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression are being fought, how through these struggles they give birth to new subjectivities, new institutions, and we can think of these new forms of mobilization, these new institutions that are born through struggle as sort of the niche innovations that scholars of transformation are looking at. And finally, you know, how can we as academics provide support to these frontline communities? Thank you very much. Oh, are you going to ask me now or later? You can maybe ask both of us later.
Yeah, I'll do it together.
Okay.
You can probably hear me from here. Are these working? Oh, you're still holding it. I realized that I didn't ask Leah her questions, so I'll ask Leah and Asad their questions together before we start the Q&A, while you're all thinking about your own questions. So it's now, thank you very much, Leah. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Asad Rehman, who is currently the Executive Director of War on Want, which is a radical campaigning charity that works to end poverty and injustice both globally and in the UK. He's got 35 years or more experience in campaigning, has acted as spokesman for a host of campaign causes, which I won't list all of them now to save time, and has been involved in a number of global movements concerning economic justice, climate justice, and migration. Previously to his role at War on Want, he led Friends of the Earth's work on international climate change and has been pivotal in reframing environmental and climate justice issues into issues of economic and racial justice. He's served on the boards of Amnesty International UK, Friends of the Earth International, and has spoken at various UN summits, global events, not to mention countless marches and rallies and other events. So welcome, Asad. He's complaining that I've made him sound dull, but I'm sure he'll disperse you of that fairly soon.
If you don't know War on Want, we're a radical campaigning organisation. We were founded in opposition to the war in Korea many years ago, hence our name. The only war worth fighting was the war against want. And our founding slogans were and still are justice not charity, poverty is political, and those have been the guiding principles which have shaped how War on Want has worked, and we've stood very much in solidarity with movements in the global south, first against colonialism and imperialism, and we continue to do today against neoliberalism and extractivism and climate and issues around climate justice. And we don't do aid or handouts. We are not that kind of charity, but we actually engage in very much practical solidarity. We focus on everything from workers' rights to land rights to defending the right to food, to sovereignty. And we organise in this country very much around with the labour movement, workers, migrants, and young people. And we really try and focus on the root causes of oppression. And that's very much what shapes us very, very differently, I would say, from many others in the NGO sector. And we see ourselves in that arc of the global movement for justice and intersectional movement. So let me first apologise if my talk isn't going to be as coherent as it should be. I'm going to blame Gareth and Leah for that, because last night when we were having dinner, we had a bit of a lively discussion about the state of the climate movement. And so on my way back to the bedroom, I was giving me plenty of thought, and I thought, okay, you know what, I'm going to ditch my talk and I'm going to do something very, very different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sacrifice zones and a reflection on the politics of the climate movement. Now, let me start by making another confession. I am a reluctant environmentalist. I never chose to be an environmentalist. It's not the frame I look into the word. It wasn't the cause that inspired me. Absolutely not. But weirdly, I found myself spending the last 2 decades as an anti-racist and a climate justice activist fighting in that particular space. And I want to say a few words about that journey because it maybe helps sort of illustrate sort of my analysis and where I'm come from. I was born in Pakistan. I'm a child of migrants. I came to this country. For those of you who grew up in this country, you might tell from my accent, I grew up in a little town. I was going to say a shitty little town in Lancashire. It's a small industrial town that was wrought with poverty and racism. And in fact, it's one of the many forgotten towns in this country. And it's probably its most biggest claim to fame was the fact that it elected 13 neo-Nazis to the local authority there. And that, as a black community, we faced daily attack. And I say black, and I have to also then, politics has changed, say black as a colour of my politics and not the tone of my skin. And black politics was a way for us to really understand racism, not just about actions of individuals, but of course as a political phenomenon that connected our experiences in this country with our struggles of our communities back home, and linked that with the experiences of colonialism and imperialism and tried to understand that. And I suppose for many people of my generation and who wear our passports on our faces, it was hard not to be political at that point, right? We were forced into being political, first into movements such as the Asian Youth Movement, which was a big, powerful movement in the late 70s and early 80s, around community self-defense, and then into community organising. And as I said, in the midst of all of that, I mean, I was leading school strikes against racism in my secondary school, and I was always trying to understand where this phenomenon of racism came from, and tried to understand because, I was living in white working class communities. We were in poverty. Why were we the targets of all of this violence? And tried to understand that wasn't about the individuals, that it was a structural issue. It was about deep institutional racism that left my community with the worst jobs, with the worst housing, with the worst schools, and of course, facing a very, very hostile environment driven by the government. And of course, today, those same communities face all of those same problems and increase. And of course, as the issue of the day, air pollution, face far greater levels of air pollution. In fact, I now live in East London, and if you live in London, it takes you about an hour to travel from East London to West London, and in that hour you can gain a life expectancy of 10 years, because that's the difference between poorer parts of East London and the richer parts of West London. And, our politics at the time was always about internationalists, both in vision and action. And, we saw ourselves very much about connecting our struggles against racism here, but we stood with the South African people against the struggle against apartheid. We stood with the Palestinian people against occupation. We stood with Latin American people against the fight against military junta. We always understood that that our role was something more, that part of our role was to platform and articulate the voices of our communities and struggles around the world. And in that, we always, we had political education, and it's something that I think, you know, the movement lacks these days, where it forgets what happened last year, let alone what's happened in terms of decades. So we grew up on understanding, you know, what happened to Lumumba in Congo, or Mossadegh in Iran, or, you know, or even Allende in Chile, and how this struggle about leaders trying to protect their economies and protect their natural resources from exploitation from Western multinationals and governments was part and parcel of our story as well. And so that's partly what actually led me to really start to think about, you know, empire not just as an historical fact, but as an everyday reality, both for us as communities in this country, but of course for our communities in the global south. And I say that because, you know, we took that responsibility. I know it's weird now. We took that responsibility very, very seriously. We were in the belly of the beast, and we had to take all those voices and demands and really try and integrate them into the movement of the time. And I spent a long, long time in the anti-globalization movement. It was the big movement in the late 80s and 90s, you know, against neoliberalism, the WTO, IMF, and the World Bank. And you know, it was a largely white movement, I have to say, you know, especially in the UK and in Europe. It was dominated either by mainstream NGOs or by parts of the radical left. But it was also a very interesting movement because one way it was a successful movement of internationalism, because movements in the South, whether they were Via Campesina or Southern trade unions, actually were very, very successful in shaping the narratives, the demands and the analysis of that movement. And you know, from that movement, whether it was the emergence of the World Social Forum, there seemed to be a moment where actually global movements in the South were at least being able to influence the movements in the global North. And even though, of course, when it was a very different conversation when those NGOs and when those movements were in the World Social Forum and wanted to talk with movements in the Global South, but when they came back home, they still continued to have very, very little contact with their own diaspora communities or minority communities or even working class communities who were fighting many of the same injustices. And, you know, it's interesting now because, you know, when you look at, for example, the climate Extinction Rebellion and taking the streets of London, and it reminded me back again, I don't know if some of you remember, you know, that 1998 carnival against capitalism, you know, when 5,000 people besieged the International Financial Futures Exchange in London, were about to take it down. There were, you know, and then at the same time, 10,000 people marched in Harcourt in Nigeria against Shell, renamed the street Ken Saro-Wiwa, you know, and it felt like, yeah, there's a real moment here of both action in the global North and in the global South. And it was such that by Seattle, if you remember that moment in Seattle in 1999, even mainstream NGOs like Oxfam were marching with social movements demanding radical transformation, system transformation. You know, it was like, wow. And they, of course, were being influenced by this movement that was moving more and more to the left or had this transformational vision, and they didn't want to be left out and came along with it. And, of course, you could, when we look back at that moment, it was a bit of a short-lived moment because, of course, 9/11 came along and war and terror and wiped out that particular moment. But, you know, in the midst of that, all of that movement, I first came across the environment movement. I have to say I did have that prejudicial view of the environment movement. I thought, bunch of white middle-class hippies, you know, nothing to do with me. I'll never be involved with this. Why would I want to spend my political energy in this political space? But our movements and the movements that we were connected with in the Global South sort of basically said, you must do. Because there's this thing, right, with both environmental justice and climate that gives us an opportunity to be able to platform our struggles and voices to global North audiences and be able to influence the very governments and corporations and banks that were drivers of everything that they were trying to resist. So I joined, and I find myself as being one of the few non-white people in the environment movement at the time. Now there's a few more. In fact, funnily enough, I remember walking into the office my first day, and I said, where are the other black people? It's like, yay, cleaner. And there's some people in the finance office, but that was it. And it was interesting for me because, you know, I have to say I didn't know that much about climate change at that time. But of course, as more and more I read about it, I was like, why aren't all of these organizations shouting from the rooftop about the climate emergency? Why isn't there urgency? Why is it on everybody's website that, about this? And why aren't they making really radical transformational demands about the transformation that needs to happen to our economy and this? And I realized that was quite deliberate. And it was deliberate even to the extent of course, what the symbol of that movement was for the time. The white polar bear on the white iceberg. Nothing against polar bears, but of an alienating symbol, you couldn't choose anything better, I think, to best symbolize how divorced that climate movement was from the realities of political struggle. And I remember raising this issue, and I was told climate change affects us all, don't worry. And you might have heard this analogy of I don't know if it's used that much anymore, but it used to be used a lot. We're all on the Titanic together, and we're hitting the proverbial iceberg. That's the story of climate change. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. We are all on the Titanic. But aren't you all on the deck sipping cocktails, listening to the orchestra, thinking there's going to be some miraculous technological answer that's going to save you? And in the hold, isn't that all the people of the global south? And aren't they drowning? And when they try and escape, haven't you welded the hold shut? Isn't that the real story of climate change? And why aren't you telling that story of climate change? And so that it wasn't just this existential threat in the future, but it was part and parcel of the reality of today. But it was also, of course, as we know, climate change was fanning all of the existing inequalities in the world. Racial, gender inequalities, it was driving hunger, conflict, it was fueling environmental destruction, the food crisis. And it was at that time I met some people from the United States, actually, from the environmental justice movement, who used this frame of sacrifice zones. And they used it to try and explain how, whole geographical areas and the people in them were like literally being sacrificed by, and were permanently being impacted by environmental damage. And, they were mainly poor and black and Hispanic communities, and they were facing all these multiple impacts of pollution and all the indices, health, higher mortality rates, cancer rates, asthma, or every disease known, and all the stark difference in life expectancy. And I think there was studies showing that it was about 20 years difference in life expectancy from the national average. But what was interesting is their story about how when they were local people in their communities and they formed what was the environmental justice movement, which had nothing to do with the mainstream environmental movement. And they talked about how when they addressed many of these common features, they were looking at and realized that there was an economic issue at there, right? The siting of these toxic and polluting industries and the decisions that were being made about where they were being sited and who was willingly being sacrificed in that. And what was interesting was, of course, that the mainstream climate movement largely ignored that, right? And said, that's a bit too much for us, right? And those communities themselves started to develop their own movements and started talking about these sacrifice zones. And of course, they made more and more links, both nationally and internationally, and tried to build their own solidarities. And they've realized that they were just being ignored by the whole of the political system, both by political decision makers, but also by the very groups that you would think would be coming to their aid and their support. And that they saw that their environmental injustices were linked to economic deprivation and political invisibility. And that ultimately they were trapped in this endless cycle of poverty and powerlessness as a result of capitalism, the big C word that you can never mention in NGOs. And there was an American journalist, Chris Hedges, who then termed this word sacrifice zones, and he wrote, these are areas that are destroyed for quarterly profit. We're talking about environmentally destroyed, communities destroyed, human beings destroyed, families destroyed. It's the willingness on the part of people who seek enrichment to destroy other human beings. And because the mechanisms of governance can no longer control them, there is now nothing within the formal mechanisms of power to stop them from creating essentially a corporate state. And I thought that was really interesting for me, about a way to try and understand all these multiple inequalities and the crisis that people face. And I actually started to realize, sacrifice zones aren't a geographical entity, right? They're an essential reality for most of the global south, and they're the way that we begin to connect the crisis of climate change, inequality, forced displacement. And it's not simply about this moment now. It's about how we understand then that the climate crisis, the neoliberal crisis, going all the way back to colonialism and slavery, that all of them calculated essentially that the cost of doing business was creating sacrifice zones. And I say this because it really, I think, affects the state of the mind of the mainstream, of society in the North, but also of mainstream civil society organisations. Now, I'm not going to go on about all the statistics about climate change. You know all of them, right? You know, we know the urgency, we know everything. But you know what struck me is when that one graph came out, you know, which talked about 10% of the population responsible for 50% of global emissions, and the poorest 50% of the world responsible for only 10%. And of course, if you overlay them with the same statistics for inequality, you find that bottom 50% and the same 50% who, of course, live on less than $5 a day and are denied all the basic rights to a dignified life. Overlay that hunger. Yes, it's the same 3.8 billion people facing issues around hunger. Overlay that with energy access. It's the same 3 billion people who don't have access to electricity or clean cooking. And I thought about all of that, and I was like, well, why isn't the climate movement talking about all of these issues together? And it struck me that, first and foremost, it was partly because the climate movement themselves had a different theory of change, right? So overwhelmingly, the climate movement for a very, very long time had a theory of change which is an elite theory of change, right? That all that NGOs were doing was, speaking rationally from one elite to another elite, i.e. to the government, about a crisis, and then the governments would act rationally as soon as you produced the right requisite number of reports and analysis, and they would say, yes, you're absolutely right, we must make this change. Failing to recognise, of course, that there was this thing called powerful vested interest in an economic system right behind it. And it was interesting because, I spent 10 years leading Friends of the Earth International's globally, international's climate work. And so I've spent a lot of time in meetings with both NGOs and governments. And I was always struck, often because I was the only non-white person in the room, and that they were overwhelmingly, and largely men actually, always white. And I was struck by how similar the educational and even the and the class backgrounds and the language that people used to each other, and the pally kind of relationships people had, and it was clear they were hanging around in the same sort of kind of social circles, and the conversations that they would have, and they told me, that they were being pragmatic, right? They were negotiating this pragmatic relationship about, and they framed climate change, if you remember, as a technical issue. It's all about temperatures and parts per million, and that they were going to mediate this truth between themselves, and they'll end up with this art of compromise. And I remember I always used to be the naughty boy in the room, tried to platform the voice of the global south, and always told, you're being too radical. You've got to learn. It's not you've got to be too radical. You've got to be able to compromise. And of course, it's really easy compromising when you're not the one dying from the system, right? And that, I found, was what shaped a lot of the NGO thinking. Now, so the very people I thought were part of the movement that were going to help us fix this problem, I actually recognise were part and parcel of actually the problem. And I say this now because, when you think of where we are now with Extinction Rebellion and this moment, and it gives you some hope, right? Climate is back on the agenda, it's hurtled up. Why? Well, we've had this, of course, you don't need to be a climate scientist now to see that climate change is happening. And of course, the fact that, the Arctic had fires and forest fires and heat waves struck Europe proved to some extent the logic of the climate movements in the North, which said, once the impacts happen to the global North, then we'll get this movement built and everything will be all right. And of course, this moral sense of panic spread through Western society, right? And of course, the IPCC report, that when it came out about 1.5 degree warming, aided that. Although there's nothing new in the 1.5 degree report, right? I mean, everything that we have been told, we already knew. But it was interesting because, when I look at this moment, I'm reminded of a moment 10 years ago, right? When exactly the same thing happened. If you remember 10 years ago, just before Copenhagen, we had politicians talking about climate change. We had the climate movement marching. There was 30,000 people marching in London, 100,000 people who marched in Copenhagen in the midst of winter. You know, the largest climate mobilization. Obama got a Nobel Prize for coming over to Copenhagen. It was like, yes, we're going to solve the problem. And I remember the main campaign at the time. It was a big NGO climate movement campaign. It was called Tick, Tick, Tick. They had alarm bells, alarm clocks. And outside Copenhagen, in the climate negotiations, they put all the alarm clocks, and you know, and then they all went off, and they said, we're 1 minute to midnight. We must take action on climate change. And then he said, so what does action mean? No. We'll just take action. We're not going to have any demands. And that movement collapsed into change your light bulb, don't use straws, stop using bags, right? And I find it really interesting because not just that the fact that Extinction Rebellion and all of these movements happened, but last week on Wednesday, the NGO movement mobilized 15,000 of its most committed members to lobby Parliament, right? And I had a look at the website, like, God, what demands are they making? And I went through like 5 pages before I got to where the demands were. And I realized that the demands that they were making were piddly, net zero by 2045. It's like, but didn't the government just say net zero by 50? So that's the most radical demand that the NGO movement is going to make? That they're at 50 and you're like, well, make it 5 years earlier, please. You know, look, the reality of the climate science, and I find this really fascinating because the reality of the climate science is, of course, you know, there is no 12 years to save the planet, right? The planet will always be all right. The fact is, of course, at 1 degree warming, just at 1 degree warming, we're seeing killer floods, droughts, devastating every part of the world, right? And the pictures of this week, of course, of a 40-degree heat wave in France, you may have seen those pictures, you know, now people are in public fountains and swimming pools, etc. We'll start wrapping up. I've not even got to my best bits yet. And it struck me because in Pakistan, we also have a heat wave at this moment, right? We have a heat wave of 50 degrees centigrade. And last year, Pakistan registered the second highest temperature ever recorded in history, right? 2 years before that, we had a heat wave, 1,200 people died in Karachi alone. And 4 out of 10 people in Pakistan face multiple dimensional poverty. We're the 3rd most water-stressed country in the world. By 2040, it's estimated we will be the most water-stressed country. No fountains or swimming pools for people in the global south. Now, I say that because what's really fascinating about this particular moment is we now have a movement in the global north. But I would say a movement without demands. Because I look at the 3 principal demands of the Extinction Rebellion, for example. And I'm not pissing on the parade because I say this from love and solidarity as part of the broader movement, right? Tell the truth. Okay, whose truth? What truth are you going to tell? Are you going to tell the truth that actually climate change has been good for the economies of the global north, that the Norwegian economy grew by 30% because of the climate crisis, that the Nigerian and Indian economy took a 30% hit? Are you going to tell the truth about the fact that, you know, the wealth of this country, which allows us to think about adaptation, was built on the exploitation of the global south? That when Britain went to India, India's share of the global GDP was 24.4%. When it left, it was at 4%. That England, Britain took 10 trillion from India alone. That if it was left, would be compounded to about 40 trillion. We're going to tell that truth. Are we going to tell the truth that when Britain ended slavery, it didn't pay compensation to the slaves. It paid compensation to the slave owners. Slave owners that 40% of Britain's GDP, the equivalent, was paid in compensation. We only paid that debt off in 2015. For the last 185 years, we've been paying a debt to the slave owners for a decision to abolish slavery. Are we going to tell that story? Are we going to tell the story that actually the wealth of Britain, 22% of Britain's GDP comes from the City of London, and of the City of London, 1/3 of all the value of the City of London comes from the extractive industries? Are we going to tell that story? Or are we going to tell the story of, you know, well, we'll all be fine, there will be some technological answer, and the climate emergency, adopt climate emergency. And it's, of course, deeply ironic that Britain was the first country that adopted the climate emergency, and in the same afternoon issued the green light for Heathrow expansion. The Canadians adopted it and gave a green light for pipelines. The Irish adopted it and said yes to drilling. So the reality is the climate, these are, to me, meaningless, right? Because they give an impression of people that actual action is being taken. And the third demand, net zero by 2025. Now, that's a bold demand. Personally, I hate the word net zero for many reasons. One, because I think it gives, and again, a cop-out that there will be some miraculous cure, carbon capture and storage. The only technology we know that exists is bioenergy carbon capture and storage. Of that, you would need 2 to 3 times the land of India to grow the bioenergy. And when we see that the crisis that 70% of the world's population rely on 25% of land for food production, whose land will be taken? So I think there is a real deep issue. Now, I could go on and say, well, actually, you can trace that back, right? You can trace that back to the Enlightenment. And you think about, you know, how all the way through the Enlightenment, this moment of rationale and reason, actually, rationale and reason was always predicated on this notion of protecting Western and what we call quote-unquote white society. We could talk about, you know, how, you know, all the philosophers from John Locke to Kant all talk about, you know, this idea of, you know, yes, there should be liberty and freedom, but it's always curtailed and it's always a hierarchy. And I think that that's played out a lot in the climate movement. So we have a real challenge, I think, in terms of at this moment, in terms of our climate movement. Because to build the real intersectional climate movement that is actually required isn't going to be answered by the issue of the Green Deal. And I know that's now the most radical proposition being put on the table, is that, yes, we will answer the crisis of austerity in the global north by tackling and providing jobs, greening our economy. And I want to just leave you with one fact, because I've been told to shut up, right? Well, you know, the demands, and there are very, very good demands in the Green Deal. I spoke many of them on a domestic level. But the idea that you can simply switch from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy is absolutely nuts. One, the IPCC says for that 1.5 degree pathway, we'd have to see a 40% reduction in global energy use, right? Whilst, of course, half the world people don't have energy. Then we have to have access to, well, are we going to greenlight a new wave of green colonialism? Because the rare earth minerals that are needed, you know, are beyond the amount of known reserves that exist in the world, right? If Britain, simply, if just Britain, electrified all of its cars, we'd use 1/3 of all the world's copper in the world, right? I mean, these are simply not technically and politically feasible. So we need much bolder and visionary demands. So yes, we should demand living wage as part of a Green Deal, but we should demand a global living wage. Yes, we should demand, you know, we have public services in this country, but the climate movement also must be demanding the right public services all around the world, global NHS, education, housing, because them are the most adaptive and ways in which to protect people facing the impacts of climate change. But we have to also think much bolder. We have to start saying it is not possible to have private corporations anywhere in the energy system. So yes, we should be talking about renewable and community-owned energy systems in this country, but actually we should be talking about energy as a public good, with environmental limits, with a clear criteria that when we talk about energy, who has the right to that energy? Is it going to be the energy poor in the global south, or is it going to be us? That gets us into conversations about what is productive energy and what is a productive economy. Things that I think that the climate movement does not want to actually talk about. But without having a vision that we can spell out to the world, without that, we're not going to get the social license to transform this world, because the flip side of that climate emergency is the stickers and posters you see in London at the moment from Generation Identity, right, the far-right group. Save bees, save trees, deport refugees. It's the climate emergency of Marine Le Pen, who says, yes, climate is absolutely critical. So the answer is our nation state, build the walls and fences. And that's exactly what Salvini, Orban, and of course others are doing. Where there was a time when I used to talk about it, say, there'll come a time when there'll be machine gunning us in the Mediterranean to stop migration, right? And people are, it's too right, nuts. Now, of course, governments ban rescue boats from being able to rescue people in the Mediterranean. 5,000 people minimum dying each and every year because we're allowing it to happen. If the climate movement isn't intersectional, if it doesn't really root that experience, both historical and today's context, at the centre of its demands, of its vision, and if it doesn't understand to build power, the environment movement cannot, or the climate movement will not win. That the only way we will win is when we have built real power, and it's real power with all of those communities that Leah talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Asad. While you're thinking of your questions or comments or here's perhaps, and Asad and Leah get something to drink, I did forget to ask them some questions. So I think you probably know the answer to the last one. So I'll ask that first to Asad. Most important current environmental justice issue?
Well, climate justice, but in the broadest sense.
Well, more specifically, I guess in the Canadian context, it's stopping all these pipelines from being built.
One thing that really riles you?
I'll give you that one. I've got too many.
Yeah, also just the current situation of Indigenous communities in Canada. I mean, it's the sort of thing that, I mean, we're talking about what's happening in the global south. There's communities in Canada that have been, Indigenous communities that have been under boil water advisories for the past 20 years. Meanwhile, I mean, some of these communities, actually their water's been taken away or diverted for urban centers, and meanwhile they've been left without anything. There's one community in Canada, you can see in the atlas, where actually an aqueduct was built and it turned their peninsula into an island. So they can only reach the mainland by boat, and or in winter when the kind of the water freezes. So they've been completely cut off and isolated, and the suicide rates in these communities are through the roof. So this is kind of the perspective from one of the richest countries on the planet. And in Canada, there's, I mean, as I said, you know, why are these pipelines being built? Because it's still, if you know, if it's Indigenous communities, if it's First Nations, it's still okay.
I would say generally, I think it's the climate movement in the sense that this window of opportunity I see starting to recede, and I worry that we will lose this moment, and this movement will start to dissipate again because it's a movement. We have a movement without demands. And that has a real impact, right? Because will it be another generation? Will it be another decade before we come back to it? Because and that really taxes me. You know, you know, the difference between, you know, of course, the 1 degree and the 1.5 degree. Somebody put it really well, saying that's the equivalent of a 9/11 happening each and every day for the next 70 years in the global south. But a 9/11 which we'll never know the names of those people. We won't hear the stories. We'll just be forgotten numbers of people. And you know, and Europe will not burn in by 1.5. It will not. That's not the reality. The end of humanity will not happen in Europe, right? But the realities will increasingly happen in terms of the global south. And I really worry because I look at all of these moments, right? And I look at, you know, when I look back, not just at the Copenhagen moment, which is thing, but at the moment to running up towards the Paris Agreement. So do you remember the Paris Climate Agreement when it was signed, and headlines everywhere? Paris Climate Agreement signed. I have to tell you, I walked back to my room in total and utter despair that night. You know, and I looked around, and every NGO was like, "This is a great moment. It's a huge step forward." And I was like, "This is a poison chalice for and a death sentence for the poor." And I'm like, and then somebody tweeted me a picture of the NGO party that night, and they were singing "We Are the Champions," and they were dancing with the negotiators from Australia and Canada and New Zealand and Britain, and it was this whole love fest that they'd achieved the Paris Agreement. And I'm like, but what's the Paris Agreement done? It's been a deliberate and calculated attempt since Copenhagen to take away science-based targets, to have no historical responsibility, to have no concept of fair shares, to have absolutely no binding target, to have no responsibility for adaptation or for loss and damage, no real climate finance, and yet we're celebrating the fact that the pledges in the Paris Agreement would lead to then at least 3.4 degree warming, up to 7 degrees warming. And I in my most generous moment, I thought it's just because it's desperation, right? People, when they're desperate, will grasp anything and claim it was a victory. But in the halls of Paris, in the climate negotiations, you know, the movements were, that chant was not we want 1.5. It was 1.5 to barely stay alive, right? That they had argued. Right? In Copenhagen, we argued for 1 degree. We're saying we have to make the climate treaty have the temperature not to breach 1 degree. And the NGOs and governments, particularly the Europeans, had this 2 degree target. And the 2 degree target was literally plucked out of thin air. And the reason why it was plucked out of thin air, of course, is because it wasn't going to harm the European or British economy. The net zero target that Britain's adopted in the Climate Change Committee for 2050 has nothing to bear on what the science of fair shares is. Look, Britain's fair share of climate change would mean we have to be at minus 200 by 2030, right? That would be the accurate fair share of Britain. The net zero by 2050 is simply, it was calculated on what would cause the least damage to the British economy. That was the starting point. Not what was needed to stop the climate crisis, it was what would protect. And the fact that everybody's running to say that that's some bold climate leadership, that's what really worries me, is that, you know, what did they say? In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I mean, and this is just like, we're in this land of blindness, and anything that goes is being pulled up as being seen as being something very, very radical. And the same, and I have to be critical of the left on the Green Deal, right? The Green Deals that talk about, because whether both the American one, the British one, and now increasingly some people talking about the European one, you know, why isn't there a global Green Deal for people, right? We talk about global Green Deal. It's possible, but it would mean a much bigger transformative change. And I worry that we have lost the imagination to think of society in a very different, that neoliberalism has affected all of us so much that we can't think of anything beyond the parameters of what exists. And if we continue to be locked into that, then I think then we really should be talking about, you know, what will happen when wherever 250 to 1 billion people are going to be on the move by between up to 2050 and forced displacement. And the reality, of course, that they will be displaced in poorer countries, and we will genuinely be having, I think, machine guns on the borders of Europe, right? I mean, we're willing now with our EU agreement with Libya to finance the detention camps, which are slave camps, because we want to push our border into Libya. We're doing the same, well, we're doing the same with Sudan. We have the same agreement with Turkey. We have the same agreement with Morocco. I was at the Global Compact on Migration, and the biggest conversation was, how does Europe push its migration border into sub-Saharan Africa? How could they contain people there, and then Europe would decide who it needs, when it needs, for how long, and then choose migrants to come on. Like I think that's happened before in history somewhere. You mass lots of people from Africa, and then you decide who you need to come and work. And yeah, I mean, I genuinely worry for that. You know, as you can see, I'm a bit of a depressive on that. I'm generally optimistic.
I'm ready to take some questions from the floor. So I've got one up the back. Can you take a roving mic? The back right and then the back left. But I can reveal to you that while Asad's worrying about the state of the world, he prefers to be doing it eating a chicken curry on the beach or in his garden.
Hey. Thank you both for elucidating and then inspiring lectures. And I was prepping to say that it's good to see Asad not gaining in cynicism after all these decades, but then he had this extra speech after the lecture. So I'll just limit my comment to a question of comment from both of you as to how to work on generating global trust back, because in the last UNFCCC, with everything you've said about Paris and Copenhagen, in Bonn, where we're preparing for Santiago and then likely Manchester next year, when again we're going to have a crunch fight. Saudi Arabia is joining with African group of nations in dismantling the 1.5 science because of the lack of trust with Europe and the global north. But that isn't helping anyone in setting a workable target either. So comment on solidarity gain back. Thanks.
Can we take the other question in the back? Can you run around so we can take them together while you're thinking about your response?
Oh yeah, fascinating talks there. Just a quick question for Leah. I was interested in these kind of transformative remedies, and I wanted to think about kind of rebel movements in terms of moving beyond the nation state, such as places in Rojava and less recently in Mexico with the Zapatistas. And I was wondering if you'd heard other kind of stories or thought there was potential to think about those kind of transformations in Canada and beyond in terms of achieving ecological justice.
Yeah, okay, I'll take that question first. So yeah, part of this work is inspired by the work of Indigenous communities in Canada, and this frustration with seeking or state-led efforts of recognizing Indigenous peoples and these sort of false processes of reconciliation that are happening in Canada. I mean, in particular, I had pointed to a paper I was writing about a community called the Unistoten, that they have set up what they term a checkpoint to defend their unceded territory. And I mean, what them and other communities are doing is saying, you know, we are, like, this is our unceded territory, and within our territory, we're practicing our own cultural practices. We're putting in place our Indigenous laws. And this is, there's a lot of literature by Indigenous scholars that I would recommend you to look at. Some of them are Leanne Simpson, Glenn Coulthard, Jeff Corntassel, for example. And it's about resurgence of Indigenous ways of being and knowing, and Indigenous laws. So it's, I think, differentiated perhaps from this kind of projects on the scale of the Zapatistas at this point of time, but it's really this idea of, okay, we have to, you know, there's, what are the limits to what are the limits to what the state can grant? And it also goes back to this legal history of fighting in courts for recognition, and then realizing that, well, we're fighting for recognition within colonial courts that don't even have the sovereignty to grant us the underlying right which exists to us. So how do we create these spaces? And I think that these are pretty inspiring examples. So it's not that, and I think it's important, this, what I had mentioned previously about this diversity of tactics. So these communities, they're still fighting in the colonial courts. They have to do that, but at the same time as they fight for space in the colonial courts, they also continue to put in place their own cultural practices, their own Indigenous laws. I'll pass you to answer the solidarity question, and then if I have.
Sure. And
Wrench the microphone.
yeah, you can wrench it, definitely. Do please. I've always categorized the climate negotiations as, like, you know, as this struggle. Anybody who's been to the climate negotiations know that the one thing it's not talking about is climate. It's always about political economy, and it's a struggle between what I would call the old empire, want to continue domination, and usually former colonial countries wrestling power back. But its weakness have always been a reflection of actually just the state of play, right? Because it's not the space itself that's a problem. And I know there's some part of our movement that said, oh, COPs are just terrible, they're never going to be the solution. But ultimately, climate change is an issue of the global commons, right? No one country will ever solve it. We will need a global agreement, and we will need to be able to achieve that. But to do that, we have to transform political power. We have to be able to shape the governments and our decision makers who are going there. And that's ultimately, we've never done that, right? I mean, we mobilize at the last moment in December when the COP comes and think, oh, things will have changed then. Of course not. Look, this is as I said, it's a fight about political economy, and that means transformational work at local and national level for a very long time. And I'm hoping now with the COP coming to the UK that this will be a moment, right, for the UK climate movement, one, to learn a bit of humility about its role in the rest of the world, but also to learn from the Global South, right? The Global South hasn't been like pictures of victims, right? When the people aren't victims in that, people have been resisting, and they've got real genuine demands that if they were being articulated by the Global North, actually could make a transformational change and would change the political dynamics. And I think there's a lot that we can do, and we should be optimistic about that moment. I mean, we're thinking about, look, we should be rallying around a climate emergency bill that puts into law the 1.5 degree guardrail, fair shares, and tackling inequality, so structural, putting on all public and private institutions. That would dramatically impact on the mining exchange, the City of London, the role of multinationals domiciled here. But it will also set the change in terms of what the UK needs to be doing. I mean, we can genuinely take responsibility and sort of do much more. So I think that's, for me, is solidarity. And of course, solidarity will also be that more as our movements from the Global South come for the climate talks, they'll be pointing out, you know, that's your City of London, that's the target. When we talk about the names and addresses of climate change, there they are, right? That's your responsibility. It's not the war, it's not bridges and roads that are killing us, it's these things. I think that will be a very, very important moment for us to be able to learn. Just in terms of on the rebel movements as well, you know, that was always in the anti-globalization thing, right? One no, many yeses, right? There are many, many yeses. And again, I think it's a moment for us to understand that there are spaces being created in the Global South, but also in the Global North, right? Of course, from, you know, sort of communities taking control of energy, thinking about how it controls the levers of local democracy, of utilities, beginning to think about what a genuine green transition and a justice transition would look like, not just as a word, but actually about transforming the economy. I think there is amazing hope out there and amazing transformational opportunities and much that we can learn. And I hope that those stories from, you know, the ones that you talk about, Colombia, will have educated our movement, you know, so they won't think that that our job is the no. And I didn't go on talk about this, but it's very interesting about the role of UK philanthropy and UK trusts and foundations as to why, for example, in the Global South, you know, the most well-funded campaigns were the campaigns against coal, right? And that were funded by European and American foundations. And it's absolutely right, communities need to resist coal, but they wouldn't fund a yes campaign to like community-owned energy, or they wouldn't be funding the same level of campaigns here in Europe against gas, right, which will lock in our infrastructure for the next 40 years. It has become a way of like taking the lowest hanging fruit, focusing on that because people feel the need to have victories. But if those victories are hollow, and that's not being pessimistic, I want to be optimistic about real victories.
Thank you. I have one question down here to my right. While you're walking across for that, I have two questions from Slido. That's good to see. The first is to Asad. Do you think the Fridays for the Future movement is lacking demands? If so, how can the current momentum be injected with useful demands? And one for Leah. Harvey, presumably David Harvey, said that the transformative limit of environmental justice movements lays in their NIMBY, not in my backyard focus. How can we move to a not in anyone's backyard approach? And then I'll take the question from the floor as well, and we'll answer those together.
So my question's to both Leah and Asad, and thank you both for your presentations. When I'm really interested in this idea of sort of transformative change that is globally inclusive, but I would love to hear your response to the whole idea of resiliency. I think we need to have a more critical perspective on resiliency as to who it is we're expecting to be resilient and how resiliency becomes the solution of, that's a bottom-up strategy to say that let's involve communities, but to think about resiliency often means who has to bear that burden of resiliency. And if you have any sort of thoughts as to how to take that notion of resiliency and push it a little bit further.
Thank you. So I'll give it to Asad first, and then Leah for those 3 questions together. I am aware that we are already running over time. Don't worry. The tea and coffee will still be there. We will have a shorter amount of time to drink it, but we'll just have one last batch of questions after these. So Asad first.
On the Fridays for Future, I bet youth climate strikes. Actually, that's where I've got the biggest hope, because they have been willing to actually adopt demands. The youth climate strike in this country has adopted the Green Deal. Okay, they can go further, but there's a willingness there, actually, that surpasses what I would call the more mainstream environment and movement to be able to do that. So I have a lot of hope, and I have also hope because I look around and I see a generation of activists now, and when I speak to them about what politicized them, they'll tell me was the war in Iraq, right? They marched on the war in Iraq, or it was the first thing that they ever got involved in, and now they're active in so many different things, and I look at that people, and I having spoken at some of the Friday Future, I'm blown away by the articulation by young people of actual system change, of connecting their struggles, and of having an analysis that you will not hear NGOs talk about, and they're 14 and 15 are standing and having this. So there is real, genuine, I think, hope in terms of if we can link those movements, and I think this is the hope, we can link them generally to movements in the global south, then that resilience builds for that movement in the long term. They are taking the good steps. The idea of a climate strike, of course, is September, but the reality is, of course, we're living in a world now where in the global north, not many people are in unions, most people are in precarious work, not many people will be able to walk out apart from potentially universities and schools. But the idea, I think, is a really important one, and it begins to have a conversation that what will, that movement look like. And we've always said any successful movement in Europe has to have young people, it has to have the labour movement, it has to have minority and diaspora communities, and then it also has to have this other sort of what I would call the liberals, right? Who you pull to you because there's a radical axis in terms of it. And on the resilience, and that's why we talk about the Global Green Deal for people, really important for us about resilience, that it's a part and parcel, that the resilience of around climate change, we move away from this idea that you adapt to climate change in this abstract to building people's resilience. So that's why you have to have a global living wage. You have to have it. You have to have global public services. We have to start thinking in that kind of term that makes people understand what actual climate adaptation and resilience means. So we should be, as I say to campaigners in this country, when we say NHS here, we should say global NHS. When we say whatever the demand we make here, we should be talking and saying, because that connects people and it gets us back to, weirdly, things that 71 years ago we signed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? The right to housing, education, health, the right for everybody to have a dignified life. This is, within it, I think, an opportunity for us to begin a different kind of conversation around climate change, using different terms that connect and build our power. And that should always be our starting point. What builds our power collectively? What is the frame? What is the language we must use?
Thank you. So about this question of David Harvey, actually, I'm writing something about that, sort of critiquing what Harvey critiques is, he says, the EJ movement could be this movement of, he calls it militant particularisms, or, this idea of NIMBYs, that they're just focused on the local, and making the point that actually, no, a lot of these movements are moving towards what we can kind of consider this militant commonality or militant solidarity. But I think we can, I think it's important to modulate that a bit. So in the example I gave of El Salvador, that's an environmental justice struggle at the local level, but they're, really fighting corporate power and the structures of corporate power at the global level. And they have to do that, actually, to defend their struggle. So they don't really have much of a choice in this case. And then we have other struggles. For example, right now in many countries, such as France, you have a ban on fracking. But what is happening, and I think this is where we see that, how these struggles articulate still remains to be very structured by colonialism, because you have bans on fracking in France, you have bans on fracking actually in some US states, but then they are still buying the fracked gas and importing the fracked gas from different countries, in the French case of North Africa, as you mentioned, or in the US, for example, New York has put a ban on fracked gas. So, we don't want to exploit that in our state, but they're still displacing the costs and importing the fracked gas from Pennsylvania. So I think that it's this kind of structures of colonialism that make us blind in many cases to how we're implicated. And as, in Canada, for example, which is our mining companies are probably the worst in the world, the reality is that we are all implicated. Very implicated. All of our pension funds, all of our investment, the basis of our economy is based on these companies. So it's obviously requires a much bigger change. And I think this kind of ties back into some of the two previous questions about building processes of global solidarity. If we say that, it's not the workers' movement that can be this agent for transformative change now, and how can the environmental movement take over this role? This is the sort of global consciousness that we need to begin to build, which I think is happening to a degree. And going back to this fracking movement, you do see perhaps, while they're not seeing perhaps, I think, these other place-based extractive movements and how they're linked together, and this is why we have the Atlas. They begin to resist fracking in their communities, and then they begin to talk about climate change. So in that way, it's breaking down the militant particularism, and I think that this kind of potentials for having a symbiotic relationship with our relationship with nature, understanding things in that way strengthens the potential for this green international, or however we want to think of it, to continue to gain force. Because these ideas, whether it be the rights of nature, regardless of how it's operating in practice, are beginning to really become disseminated around the world. And I do think that people's mindsets are changing. This is how these kind of radical ideas percolate.
We will leave it there. We can all get some tea and coffee, but a reminder that we have some representatives of the future coming at lunchtime, right? Some children from the Angel Road Public School. And if you haven't seen the posters that they put together, do have a look while you're getting your tea and coffee, and hopefully that will infuse you with some hope rather than despair. Thank you so much to Leah and Asad for this session.